Welcome to the Stuart Cohen Book Review. We're very excited to have Stuart with us. I am Susie Athenson. I am the president of the Preservation Foundation. So thank you all for coming today to hear this fascinating lecture on this great new book. First, a big thank you to Art Miller for arranging this visit from Stuart. Thank you to Trey Gonzalez and Courtney Trombley for organizing this event. And of course, thank you to Marcy Kerr, our executive director, for the incredible amount of work she does to keep us rolling. And lastly, thank you to our members for your continued support. Your contributions allow us to continue our advocacy, education, and fundraising. So I'd like to introduce Stuart Cohen. Stuart, FAIA, is a practicing architect, educator, and author. He is professor of architecture emeritus at the University of Illinois, thank you, Chicago. In 2018, Stuart received an Arthur Ross Award from the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art for contributions to architectural history and theory. Cohen and Hacker were the 2019 recipients of the Society of Architectural Historians Award for Design, Academics, and Scholarship, and he is the recipient of the Chicago Chapter AIA 2021 Lifetime Achievement Award. Thank you. In his newest book, Frank L. Wright and the Architects of Steinway Hall, A Study in Collaboration, Stuart examines the collaboration among designers of Frank Lloyd Wright's 1890s to 1910s generation and shows his fascination with architectural ideas, their origins, and their evolution. The book profiles many architects who contributed to Lake Forest architecture, including Hugh Garden, Alfred Granger, Arthur Hune, Dwight Perkins, Howard Van Doren Shaw, Robert Spencer, Frank Lloyd Wright, and others. Stuart has an impressive repertoire of additional books on architecture and architects in the Chicago area that are a must for any architectural buff. These include Inventing the New American Home, Transforming the Traditional, Great Houses of Chicago, and North Shore Chicago. So please welcome Stuart Cohen.
Okay, so that's the cover of my book, and on the right-hand side of that image is a letterhead by Frank Lloyd Wright. It's dated June 15th, 1897, which would have been shortly after Wright moved into Steinway Hall. I've just included the letterhead portion, but it's actually a letter from Frank to his mother. It does raise some questions, though. I decided that I wanted to call the book Frank L. Wright because that's the way he signed himself for many years. Tim Samuelson claims that he changed his middle name from Lincoln to Lloyd around 1900 because in going through the drawings for the Heller House on the south side of Chicago, Tim found the early drawings titled Frank L. Wright, architect, and the later ones titled Frank Lloyd Wright. But here's his letterhead from 1897 titled Frank Lloyd Wright. So please buy lots of books so there's a second edition so I can fix that because I have the date wrong. In any case, my presentation this afternoon is going to be based on my book, Frank Lloyd Wright and the Architects of Steinway Hall, and it is a study in collaboration. So in Wright's 1932 autobiography, he remembers, quote, I had met Robert Spencer, Myron Hunt, Dwight Perkins. Dwight had a loft in his new Steinway Hall building too large for him, so we formed a group, outer office in common, workroom screened apart in the loft of Steinway Hall. These young men, newcomers in the architectural practice like myself, were my first associates in the so-called profession of architecture. Okay, so here are the guys that were in that loft space, and interestingly enough, although Wright suggests that they all moved in together immediately, Dwight Perkins was there for almost 2 years working on commissions before he invited the rest of these guys to join him. Okay, so in 1897, Robert Spencer, who is on the left at the top of the screen, Frank Wright, Dwight Perkins, Myron Hunt, moved in together. With them were an Italian named Adamo Boari, Henry, and then going into the bottom line of the headshots, Henry Holt and Francis Kirkpatrick. I couldn't find a picture of Kirkpatrick, but they worked for Perkins. Jules Guerin, who of course is famous for the magnificent renderings at the Art Institute of the Burnham and Bennett plan, and then Birch, Burdett Long, who was famous as a architectural renderer, and Marion Mahony, who was Dwight Perkins' first cousin. Walter Burley Griffin, who is the last person shown on the right-hand side, would join them soon after they all moved in, and he went to work initially for Perkins and then later worked for Wright at his new studio in Oak Park. Wright would work on and off in Steinway Hall for almost 10 years, but after the studio's constructed, he's actually splitting his time between those two locations. Given the importance of these men on the development of early 20th century American architecture, it's remarkable how little we know about the time they spent working together. Wright devotes only a few paragraphs in his an autobiography, later in a testament, and Marion Mahony, who worked for Perkins in the loft before moving to Wright's Oak Park studio, devotes only a few sentences to Steinway Hall in her autobiography, The Magic in America. She would later move back to the loft in Steinway Hall to take over Wright's practice, along with Herman von Holtz, when Wright fled to Europe with Mamah Cheney, creating the wife of one of his clients, creating a scandal that, at least in Chicago, he never really recovered from. It was in Steinway Hall that Mahony and her husband, Walter Burley Griffin, drew their winning competition entry for the design of the Australian capital city of Canberra. Over the years, various historians have noted this confluence of talent, but sadly, no extended first-hand account exists from any of the residents of the Steinway Hall loft. By the late 1890s, Steinway Hall, which was built as offices and showrooms for Steinway pianos, actually for Lyon and Healy, who was the Chicago distributor, Steinway Hall was the address of preference for over 50 of Chicago's practicing architects. Although written after both Wright and Perkins had left Steinway Hall, the best description of working there comes from a letter written by Roy Lippincott, who married Walter Burley Griffin's sister and moved to Canberra, or moved to Australia with them in 1914. Lippincott was working for Herman von Holtz, and he tells us, quote, "In Steinway Hall was a congress of architects, Arthur Hoyne, who's built here in Lake Forest, quote, society man and conservative, Webster Tomlinson, who early on was Wright's partner, interested in slide rule computations for the design of concrete beams. The Pond brothers, I.K., one-time national president of the AIA, and A.B., his brother, bachelors who had their offices in the top of the building, and roamed through the offices as though they owned them, to the delight of the real owners. My introduction to I.K. was one day when von Holtz was out. He came into the office, mounted my drafting board, and standing on his hands with feet in the air, gave me a critique of the work thereon." Up in the penthouse, Robert Spencer, Horace Powers had an attractive office which was shared by Walter Griffin. We were all, quote, "We were all good friends, in and out of each other's offices as though they were our own. We all knew about each other's work and were doing that. We all knew about the work the others were doing and worked for each other from time to time as pressures necessitated." So he's talking about sharing employees. So Pond and Pond actually moved in right after the building was finished, before Wright and Spencer and Hunt had moved in. On the left-hand side of your screens are the Pond brothers, Allen on the left and Irving on the right. And then On the right-hand side of the screen is Irving Pond doing a handstand. In public, he frequently amused people by walking down the streets in Chicago and spontaneously doing backflips. So he was an amateur gymnast, and he continued doing that into his 70s, if you can imagine. So Roy Lippincott suggests a culture of collaboration, which I believe describes the work of Spencer, Wright, Perkins, and Hunt in Steinway Hall. No one has actually tried to understand what these men shared or how their backgrounds and aspirations shaped who they would become. To do this in the absence of written documentation, we need to look at the work and the ideas they produced during the time they spent together and how this work influenced the architecture they would go on to do. So for me, a side-by-side comparison of projects from this period was possible because of the extent to which each of these men publicized and published their works in publications such as the Inland Architect and Building News, the Chicago Architectural Club, which they were all active in, had a yearly exhibition and published a catalog for many years, as well as publications such as House Beautiful magazine, which originated here in Chicago before moving to Boston, the Ladies' Home Journal, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and then professional publications like the Architectural Record and Architectural Review. The impetus for this study was a book by Michael Farrell called Collaborative Circles, Friendship Dynamics, and Creative Work. In it, Farrell, who was a group psychologist, writes, quote, "I saw the possibility of using group theory to understand the dynamic of circles of artists and writers. According to Farrell, these circles are usually people in their 20s or 30s who see their work in opposition to the status quo, challenging the established traditions in their field. They may not yet know what they'll come to profess, but they know what they dislike about current work in their discipline. These circles are formed usually by friends who come together to work through the parameters of a new shared vision. Such groups are usually 3 to 5 people, all in the early stages of their career. They often work together on collaborative projects and will later undertake projects aimed at winning public support for their ideas, such as exhibitions and publications. According to Farrell, as the members increase in skill and intellectual maturity, they will leave the group, and the lifespan of such associations, he says, is rarely more than 10 years. So this seemed to perfectly describe the group of architects who occupied Dwight Perkins' loft in Steinway Hall. Okay, and 2 images of Steinway Hall, which was 17 East Van Buren, later renumbered as 64. And the illustration on the right-hand side was a real estate advertisement for the building, and it's a drawing done by Henry Holt. So we could ask, what did these men have in common when they moved into Steinway Hall? They were all about the same age, with Robert Spencer, the oldest at 32. All but Wright, who had no formal education, had studied at IIT under its classical Beaux-Arts curriculum. Perkins stayed after his graduation at MIT in Boston and worked for Henry Hobson Richardson. Spencer and Hunt worked together in the office of Richardson's successors, Shepley, Rattan, and Coolidge in Boston, and then came to their Chicago office when it opened here. Wright worked for Joseph Lyman Silsby, a progressive residential architect, and then for Adler and Sullivan. From Sullivan, I think he absorbed the compositional lessons of the École des Beaux-Arts, the famous school of architecture in Paris. And I think he did this in part by designing the ornament for his mentor's buildings. Ornament which is, I would say, classically structured in terms of its organization and layout of its elements. So Wright and Perkins knew each other socially as members of All Souls Church, which was presided over by Wright's uncle, the Reverend Jenkin Lloyd Jones. As young architects, they were all part of a progressive movement that believed that America should have and should develop its own characteristic architecture. They all, of course, knew and admired Louis Sullivan, considered him both a mentor and their inspiration. Dwight Perkins had worked for Burnham and Root, becoming Root's chief assistant. After Root's death, he ran Daniel Burnham's office while Burnham was absent overseeing the construction of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And this he did in exchange for Burnham's promise to help him when he left to establish his own architectural practice. So in all likelihood, the commission for Steinway Hall was probably steered to Perkins through Daniel Burnham. Okay, so we're looking at the ground floor plan here of Steinway Hall. I actually brought a laser pointer, but I don't know how to do that in two directions at the same time. So hopefully most of you are comfortable looking at and reading plans, but what I think is really fabulous about the ground floor plan is that you actually entered, if you remember the front facade of the building, you entered under that base. So we're actually not looking at the ground floor, we're looking at what the English would call the first floor. And you came in and then you went up a flight of stairs and you were actually at the entrance to the main recital hall in Steinway Hall with the elevators to the upper office floors on either side of you. Really lovely plan. And then on the right-hand side is, of course, Perkins' design for the recital hall. Perkins had planned during the building's construction to move into the loft attic, and he added skylights, and he also added a stair accessing the attic directly from room 1107. So can you guys, I can't point, but can you see that? If you look at the upper part of the plan on the left-hand side, that whole zone going across were Pond and Pond's offices, and then on the right-hand side of that plan, it says Perkins 1107, and what you'll notice is that you come in and there's a kind of closet, and there was a sink in a closet, which was typical for office buildings of this vintage or period. And then there's what looks like a closet with a little door into it and a very steep winding stair that goes up to the floor above, which was the loft space that they actually shared. Okay. On May 2nd of 1897, the Chicago Inter-Ocean, one of Chicago's daily newspapers, reported in their real estate section that, quote, an interesting experiment in architectural practice has recently been inaugurated in Steinway Hall by 4 young men. These young men have united in a general office, the expenses of which are prorated according to the amount of use each makes of the telephone, the typewriter, etc. This, however, is not the greatest advantage which they feel they gain by this arrangement. The economic advantage derived from cooperation they feel to be insignificant besides the benefit of inspiration coming from the association with each other and contact with each other's ideas. Over the years, Wright continued to describe this collaborative circle, placing himself in an ever more central role. In a testament, which is 1957, I think, he writes, I, with those nearest me, rented a vacant loft in Steinway Hall, a building Dwight Perkins had built. Spencer Hunt and Birch Long, who he in parentheses calls clever boy renderer, although Long was the same age as Wright. So Spencer Hunt and Birch Long, clever boy renderer, moved in with me. It was Dwight Perkins's loft. Together we subdivided the big attic into studio-like drafting rooms. We felt the big attic especially appropriate for our purpose. And then he continues, I patiently worked on their plans when I could be helpful. My most enthusiastic advocate, young Myron Hunt, I think Hunt was a year older than Wright, but no matter. My most enthusiastic advocate, young Myron Hunt, was first among them to set up in Evanston, Illinois, with the building of the Mrs. Catherine White House. And he says set up in Evanston because Hunt built a house for himself there, and then subsequently he had gone to Northwestern and built lots of stuff for his fraternity brothers from Northwestern in Evanston. But he says first with the building of the Mrs. Catherine White House, that was a characteristic instance, I believe myself, helpful to them all. Well, Wright claims to have done this building, which I think he first suggests in this quote. So we're looking at the Catherine White House, which is actually a double house that Hunt was incredibly proud of. The plan was based on the house he had built for himself almost 2 years previously in Evanston. So not only Wright, but Marion Mahony claimed to have had a hand in the design of this building. Easy to understand, it's a really nice house. So looking at the building, there are elements which are neither characteristic of Wright's later work nor really Mahony's, but the half timbering, I think, has a relationship to Spencer's Stanley Gripe House, which we'll look at in a moment. The planting that drips over the edge of the balcony is clearly Marion Mahony contribution because it shows she added it to almost all of Wright's projects. So if you know the early drawings of Frank Lloyd Wright houses, they always have planting like that. And then historians have speculated about the unusual peaked roof, which flattens out at the eaves. And they point to Frank Lloyd Wright's George Smith House in Oak Park, which was the only other time Wright used a roof of that form. But contemporaneous with it, Myron Hunt built the John Sweet House in Evanston. They're both 1898. So in all probability, it was Hunt's design, but he had help from both Wright and Mahony. So this is probably the earliest true example of this kind of interaction with respect to the design of a building like this. Okay, so here we're looking at, in the upper left-hand corner, the house I just referred to, the Stanley Gripe House by Spencer. And Marion Mahony, when she started working for Wright in the loft, remembered a rendering of Spencer's pinned up over his desk. From her description, this was probably the 1894 Stanley Gripe House in Evanston. The house certainly influenced Wright's 1895 Nathan Moore House in Oak Park, which is the half-timbered house just below it. And I think there are other influences that you can see in things like the speculative house that Wright did for his friend Charles Roberts. What interests me a lot in the comparison of these houses is if you look at the Robert Spencer house, what I think is really interesting is not only the articulation of the stair hall here, but look at the way the roof comes down over the open entry porch and then is transformed into a front-facing gable to indicate, so that whole idea of the gabled porch as an entryway gets picked up by Wright in this developer house, which was never built, and is kind of in the Nathan Moore House in Oak Park, where the porte cochere entrance then connects to a garage. Okay, and that articulated entry porch with either a front-facing hip or gable is typical of Spencer's work. The rendering in the upper left-hand corner was a project done by Spencer and Perkins for the First Congregational Church of Wilmette. They have an arts and crafts building now, but it is not the Spencer and Perkins design. And then some more work by Spencer, and in each of these you can see the way in which the entrance is called out by a prominent porch. We could also, as a comparison, look at Wright's Nathan Moore house in Oak Park and the later house by Robert Spencer, the Adams house in Indianapolis. So what I think that these early houses with half timbering share is an interest in the compositional strategy that shows up or carries over into Wright's Prairie houses and the work of the Prairie School for dealing with windows and wall surfaces. And William Purcell, who was a noted Prairie School architect who had worked for Louis Sullivan, writing about, thank you, writing about Spencer's work in the Western Architects suggests, quote, in these buildings the intent is nothing more than a reasonable desire to panel or divide up an area of wall, or to make the natural panels, which windows are, form a visual pattern arranged to suit the fancy. So the visual ordering of window openings using timbering and then masonry piers is an idea that Wright, Spencer, and Perkins would all explore in their subsequent work. So among the significant collaborations coming from Steinway Hall around 1900 were the Abraham Lincoln Center, which we'll look at in a minute, and then Spencer and Wright's designs for model houses for the Ladies' Home Journal. Okay. Joseph Silsby had built All Souls Church for Wright's uncle, the Reverend Jenkins Lloyd Jones. Several years later, the Reverend Jones wanted to build a non-denominational community center based on the model of the settlement house. He envisioned a building that would house a large auditorium to be used for meetings, as well as religious services. It would contain a gymnasium, a bowling alley, a library, and reading rooms, as well as a kindergarten, manual training school, and space for professional offices and studio space for artists. Jones first approached Silsby, then Pond and Pond, who were the architects of Jane Addams' Hull House, as well as approaching Dwight Perkins, who was still working at that point for Burnham, prompting Frank Lloyd Wright to write to his uncle, quote, how about the plans for the new building? Am I to get a chance with the rest of the boys, or is it an open and shut walk away for Silsby? I do not want to let any architect walk off with a building with which an uncle of mine is so closely concerned. So the commission went jointly to Perkins and Wright, both active members of Jones's congregation. Perhaps Jones hired them together because Perkins had the technical expertise of building Steinway Hall, a mixed-use building with a large auditorium, while Wright had only built houses since opening his own practice. Further, Jones knew that they shared space in Steinway Hall, facilitating their collaboration. Things did not go well between Wright and his uncle, and their disputes are well documented in correspondence. Okay, so we're looking at here Sullivan's Wainwright building on the left, and the very first design for the Abraham Lincoln Center on the right. And in their design, it's really clear that Wright and Perkins appropriated Sullivan's articulation of office windows organized between vertical piers for the principal expression of the design. Jones was happy with the basic floor plan, but felt that the presence of the auditorium should, quote, shine through on the facade. He also wanted the building simplified for cost reasons. So by 1902, the building is smaller, the auditorium is actually registering on the outside, but Jones also wanted the corner columns and the recessed attic windows. Does everybody see those? Since I can't easily point to them. The recessed attic windows, which Wright and Perkins referred to as, quote, a loggia removed. Jones wrote to them, I have pled for simple lines, plain exterior for artistic and ethical reasons as well as economic. And then he goes on to say, I want no more debating exercises over the history and philosophy of architecture. I want a building. So years passed. Jones was still dissatisfied with the complexity of the building's exterior. Wright refused to remove the vertical piers from the building's corners, and Jones finally fired his nephew and hired Perkins to complete the project based on his specific instructions. Okay, so on the right of this image is the All Souls Church that Silsbee had built a number of years previously, and then Dwight Perkins's version of Steinway Hall, which, as you can see, is a very, very simple, severe masonry building. I think they were both disappointed. Wright, of course, disowned the final design, and Perkins felt the exterior to be so severe that he wrote to Jones that he wanted every drawing to carry a note stating, quote, designed in accordance with specific directions given by Jenkins Lloyd Jones and against the protest of D.H. Perkins. Okay, so Perkins, after John Wellborn Root's death, had been responsible for the Monadnock building, its completion, and the completion of the design, actually. And that's the building in the South Loop that's shown, it's on Dearborn Street, and it's shown on the left-hand side. And I've compared it here to Perkins's design for Abraham Lincoln Center, which I think nobody's gone back and looked at carefully, because I think it's actually, given what Jones insisted upon, I think it's actually a kind of amazingly handsome building. It is just about the composition of openings in a brick surface. So you get the windows banding, that is aligning into bands or strips horizontally, accented by a very faint line of different colored brick. But then you also get the windows stacking vertically into three sections, and you see the auditorium expressed by the grouping of windows with what's called a spandrel panel, where the mezzanine in the auditorium was. And then if you look at this in comparison to the Monadnock building, it is, and John Wellborn Root had molded brick and a much bigger budget to deal with, but it's a simple volume with bays. It comes down and then flares out at the bottom, which is what Perkins did with the Abraham Lincoln Center. The cornice is absolutely minimal, just as a kind of line capping the top of the building. But then what really interests me is if you look at the second floor, the auditorium floor, flanking the grouped together windows for the auditorium are these very narrow, different proportioned, incised windows. And on the facade of the Monadnock building, you can just see that on either side of the projecting brick bay, there are very similar, deeply incised windows, which are set back much further than the typical windows in the building. Okay, so for both Perkins and Wright, I think the time spent working together and developing their designs for the Abraham Lincoln Center had a big impact on work that they would go on to do. Here's Perkins, who leaves Steinway Hall to take over as chief architect for the Chicago Board of Education and designs a series of landmark schools. And I won't go into how they were different, but schools didn't have things like bathrooms on every floor or auditoriums or even playgrounds. But what you should note here is that the grouping of windows and then the outlining of them with masonry masses at the corners and then as a strip above. And if you look at Grover Cleveland, the way in which those piers pull forward and then set back with a kind of Gotha-sized stone detail actually suggests that the top row of windows are pushed in slightly, which is like that loggia or the recessed windows that Wright and Perkins had fought with Jones about. And then if we look at Wright's Larkin Building, which is 1904, which Wright was actually working on while he was working on the design for the Abraham Lincoln Center, although for the most part it was being worked on in Oak Park at his studio. You can see the grouping of the windows between vertical piers, the outlining or framing of all of that with unbroken masonry masses. And then if you look at the very top row, the windows are actually, the plane of glass is set back to create that secondary termination for the vertical bands of windows, which is what they had wanted to do in Steinway Hall. Perhaps the most interesting reworking by Wright of their Abraham Lincoln Center project is the San Francisco Call building for the newspaper. Not clear whether this was a proposal or an actual commission. Everybody thinks that it wasn't a commission, but if you look at the 1903 drawing and imagine it as a kind of stretched limo, that you've taken this building and expanded it vertically, you get I think you get the San Francisco Call building. There's a further reason why the San Francisco Call building project was so important to Wright, because he had always felt uncomfortable about Sullivan's Wainwright building, because the piers on the outside of the building are not registering or reflecting the actual structure of the building. There was a steel column line at every other pier, and for Wright, this was almost as much of a sham as putting Renaissance ornament on the outside of the building. The Call building is a very narrow concrete floor building, and those columns along the outside are poured concrete columns that are actually the structure of the building. So for Wright, this was a very important project, and he kept exhibiting it over and over and over again. In 1939, the model was rebuilt from plaster to wood, and then it was exhibited in 1912, 1914, 1930, and then as late as 1953, which would have been the wood model. So clearly, this is an important building to Wright conceptually, and I think it comes out of his collaboration with Dwight Perkins. Okay, so every Wright historian who has written about the development of the Prairie House has noted the first full-blown appearance of Wright's designs in, quote, A Home for a Prairie Town, done in 1901 for the Ladies' Home Journal, and that's the image on the bottom, okay? Wright's commission for this design came through his friend Robert Spencer, okay? Spencer was focused on the design of small economical middle-class houses. The Oak Park Reporter for May 3rd of 1900 noted that, quote, R.C. Spencer has returned from Philadelphia Thursday. He was called there by the editors of the Ladies' Home Journal and has been engaged by them to write a series of articles on architecture for publication. Spencer was asked to contribute to the magazine series featuring the design of model American houses. The series was the idea of the magazine's editor, Edward Bach, who wrote in his autobiography, which is strange because Bach refers to himself constantly in the third person, that while traveling across the country, Bach, found most houses repellently ugly and, quote, felt a keen desire to take hold of the small American house and make it architecturally better. To do this, he used the pages of the Ladies' Home Journal, which was the largest circulation and most influential of the magazines at the turn of the century, devoted to improving the American home. The series ran until Bach's retirement in 1919 and featured designs by many who were to become America's most prominent residential architects. Bach's friend Theodore Roosevelt would write, quote, Bach is the only man I ever heard of who changed for the better the architecture of an entire nation, and he did it so quickly and effectively that we didn't know it was begun before it was finished. So if we look at the images across the top, on the left-hand side is designed by Robert Spencer from the Ladies' Home Journal of 1901, and on the right-hand side is the Ward Willets House, which was completed in 1902, of which Frank Lloyd Wright says he worked on that design in Steinway Hall. And what I would point out to you is the the low-pitched hipped roofs, the expansion of wings to either side of a central mass, and then look at the way the windows are grouped between vertical piers. Okay, so here again is Design Spencer, a shingle farmhouse for $2,700 from the Ladies' Home Journal in 1901. And then the famous cruciform or cross-shaped plan of the Ward Willets House of 1902 by Frank Lloyd Wright. And if you look at the whole idea of taking the center T-shaped portion of that plan and extending it in covered porches or terraces, it's identical to the Robert Spencer plan. The location of the hearth in the plan is identical. The stair is in Spencer's behind the fireplace and Wright's to the side of it, and then the kitchen and servants' quarters are in the back part. So one could hypothesize that either this is a collaborative effort or that perhaps Wright got the idea for the layout of a whole series of houses that he did, which were cruciform in shape from Robert Spencer. I think even more interesting is the relationship between Spencer's 1901 design for a brick and shingled farmhouse, which is shown in the center, and then a whole series of cubic houses that Wright did. So if we look at Spencer's house, there's a big room, which is living and dining with a central fireplace. What is really interesting about the house is the way the stair, which comes up behind the fireplace, has been actually pulled out of the volume so that it becomes the entrance to the house. Okay, so you don't go in a front door into a vestibule and then find a stair hall with a stair in it. It's this incredibly compact thing where you actually enter into the lowest landing of the stair. So that's 1901, and Wright's house for Robbie Lamp, his childhood friend in Wisconsin, of 1903 is literally the identical plan, and that's the plan on the right-hand side. What Wright hasn't done for some reason is to not pull the stair out of the volume of the house, but the layout is identical. And then finally, Wright's fireproof house for the Ladies' Home Journal of 1907 actually cleverly rotates the stair to the side, pulls it out like the Spencer design so you can enter into it, but by relocating it, the up run of the stair actually brings you not into the back of the fireplace, but into the great room or the main room. Of course, this may all be moot in terms of where these ideas actually came from, because even though it wasn't published until 1902, the image on the top far left is a house that was designed as a cottage in Maine for a college friend of Dwight Perkins's, and it was built in 1900. And what you can see is that the plan of the house itself is nearly identical. The stair is pulled out to the side, the arrangement of dining room, kitchen, and central fireplace are identical. Supposedly, Perkins worked on this with Walter Burley Griffin, who would later go to work for Wright. So it's possible that all of these cube houses that Wright built with that identical plan were actually contributions of Walter Burley Griffin as well. But instead of entering into the stair in the Dwight Perkins plan on the upper right, there is, as you can see in the image directly below it, there's a porch or a veranda that goes all the way around. So you enter by going up onto the porch and then going directly into the main room. So the Spencer version of this is an improvement, with, I think, the fireproof house of 1907, 6 years later, being kind of the nicest version spatially of all of this. it would seem that this sequence is the source of Wright's subsequent compact cube houses, including the lamp house in Madison, which we looked at, his fireproof house, his 1908 Stockman house in Mason City, Iowa, with slight variations, the Green house of 1912 in Aurora, Illinois, the Emil Bach house on Sheridan Road in Chicago of 1915, and the Ross house in Glencoe, also of 1915. So rather than suggesting that Wright merely borrowed the plan from Spencer, there's every reason to believe that the idea for the plan and its development could have been collaborative. Although it wasn't published until 1902, the Perkins design, of course, looks like it was the beginning for all of this. Anyway, so clearly there is this kind of intense collaboration going on primarily, I think, for these houses between Spencer and Wright, and then secondarily between Dwight Perkins. At this point, Myron Huntz, whose wife has tuberculosis, has decamped for Pasadena, which I didn't know, but was a area that lots of Chicagoans went to. But Hunt had moved there permanently because of his wife's health condition, and he goes on to do the Huntington there, plan a number of college campuses, and design and build the Rose Bowl. But in any case, Wright and Spencer, I think, invented all of this stuff, basically. And Wright described Spencer as his closest friend in his 1957 book, A Testament. And Wright remembers, Bob and I were often seen together, at times borrowing each other's bohemian manners and costumes, so that Chicago conformists working in other offices, seeing us arm in arm down the street, would say in derision, "There goes God Almighty with his Jesus Christ." So I believe that Wright, describing Robert Spencer as the man who would bring his, that is Wright's, message to the world, misrepresents the collaborative source of many of the ideas that were generated by the architects of Steinway Hall. So, among the architects who worked in Steinway Hall, who figured prominently in the Chicago Architectural Club's activities and were part of the group of 18 architects who dined together on a regular basis, were architects who contributed to Lake Forest's architecture. Among them were Arthur Hoyne, who kept an office in Steinway Hall well into the 1920s. So along with Robert Spencer and his subsequent partner, Powers, they were the longest tenants of Steinway Hall. Hoyne designed Ardley for John V. Farrell, the real estate mogul, in 1896, and the McGinnis House in 1899. However, Hoyne, of course, is best known for the Armour Estate Melody Farms, for Mrs. Ogden Armour, which we're looking at here. What's interesting is, while you could say, well, what does this have to do with anything the Prairie School was doing or any of these other guys were doing? If you look at the back facade with the pond, and you look at the low-hipped roof, its extension, but then the composition, which is completed vertically by those dormer windows, it looks to me a lot like contemporaneous work by Howard Van Doren Shaw. Okay, so Dwight Perkins, who was the architect of Steinway Hall, built the Mrs. Cyrus McCormick House in 1916. So I think there's a whole category of houses that I like to call Prairie Tudor, and I think this fits into that category. And then, of course, Frank Lloyd Wright's most significant project for Lake Forest was never built, and it was a house that he designed for Edith and Harold Rockefeller McCormick. So in addition to Wright, the McCormicks also approached James Gamble Rogers before hiring well-known East Coast architect Charles Platt. Platt designed a classical villa for Edith, who thought Wright's houses were dark and overbearing. So the Charles Platt Villa Turicum, which sadly no longer exists, is shown at the bottom. And then the upper renderings are Wright's project for that house. Also active and prominent in the Chicago Architectural Club and a member of the 18 Architects Dining Club was Lake Forest. I'm sorry, I'm missing Arthur Granger. And he was part of the 18 as well as a prominent member of the Chicago Architectural Club. Granger, along with his brother-in-law, Charles Sumner Frost, built over 200 railway stations for their father-in-law, who was president of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. And Granger designed this house on Sheridan Road for himself, and it's called Woodley, and it was adjacent to Charles Frost's house, and they were married to sisters, by the way, which was their connection to their father-in-law and how they happened to build so many train stations for them. So also active, of course, in this whole group, while not in Steinway Hall, was Lake Forest's most famous architect, in my opinion, Howard Van Doren Shaw. And while Perkins got to build an office building that he located his office in, Shaw did the same, building the 1906 Mentor Building on State Street. And you can see, even in this old photograph, at the left-hand corner of that image, the Carson Perry Scott building by Lou Sullivan. So on the left is Shaw's Ragdale, and then Shaw, along with the Prairie School architects and certainly Wright and Spencer, were interested in a whole set of ideas about what houses should do from a planning point of view that involved opening them to the outside, involved interconnecting interior spaces, and that basically came from the English arts and crafts. So all of these guys admired people like Voisey, whose own house, the Orchards, is shown on the right-hand side, people like Sir Edwin Lutyens. What I found amazing is that at a certain point it begins as admiration, but I think actually that perhaps there's a kind of interaction, at least that these people were all aware through publication of what one another were doing, and I'm totally blown away by the Voisey's own house, which is often compared to Shaw's, but post-dates it. It's actually built a couple of years after Ragdale. And then, of course, there's Market Square, which I really think is Shaw's masterpiece. So to conclude, a guy named C.R. Ashby, who was an important English arts and crafts architect and designer, famous for his flatware, his hollowware, his jewelry, came to Chicago on several occasions. He lectured at the Art Institute, he lectured at the Chicago Architectural Club, and he came to Chicago in 1908 to do the same thing, a lecture tour, and he noted at that point in his memoirs that Chicago's greatest days in aesthetics were past, that Wright had grown bitter, that Louis Sullivan had spent the last years of his life writing a dreamy, chaotic prose epic. So by 1908, all the original occupants of the loft on Steinway Hall, the 12th floor, except for Robert Spencer, had departed. And as Michael Farrell had suggested, their collaborative circle had lasted just over a decade after they came together to intentionally try and transform the practice of American architecture. Thank you. But thank you. Anybody have questions? Steinway Hall was taken down in the 1950s. It's long gone. The Lincoln Center is still there on Oakwood Boulevard. What else?
The the half-timber architecture
Yes.
that you have in the Nathan Moore House was modeled after the British pavilion at the World's Columbian Exposition. And that particular pavilion was disassembled and moved to Michigan for a country club.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, one of the things to remember is that, you know, even though these guys were all Anglophiles and England seemed a long ways away, the Art Institute has English periodicals going back to the turn of the last century, and the most prominent publication, The Studio, actually did a thing called the Studio Yearbook, which was published simultaneously in London and in New York. So, you know, everybody knew what was going on. They were aware of what was happening in Vienna, and that had an impact on some of the stuff they were doing, as well as obviously the English arts and crafts movement. Okay. Yes?
It's the first time I've seen his Frank Lloyd Wright's Hall building. It's extraordinary. I feel as though the world has kind of caught up with that.
The world.
Macy in a way, this flat is thin. I'm impressed by how now I recognize it.
Okay, Mary, is that you behind the mask? It is, okay. Yeah, the sense in which it's caught up is really an interesting one, because the first of the super tall buildings done by SOM and designed by Bruce Graham, but really designed by a brilliant structural engineer named Fazlur Khan, figured out that the way you make a tall building to resist both gravity loads and wind loads, which become a huge factor at over 50, 60 stories, is to make the whole exterior of the building a structure. And they were called tube structures. So the columns, the Hancock building, even though the columns seem spaced out, those big diagonals are actually tying them all together structurally. So it's the exterior surface of the building that's acting as structure, which was exactly the way Wright's Call building would have worked had it actually been built. So even though Wright has a bad rap for not building things well, he was, that probably happened because he was as innovative as he was, and he was constantly pushing the envelope. Of course, I think he probably secretly sort of didn't care. So I'll share one anecdote with you. Years ago, I was in LA, and a friend took me to see Frank Gehry's own house for himself. And I subsequently met Frank Gehry and said, you know, I really think the house is very interesting, particularly the huge polygonal skylight over the kitchen that reflects the bay of your old Victorian house. And this skylight starts off like this, but then transforms into something that dips down into the space. And I said to him, how did you build that and not have it leak? And Frank Gehry said, well, I've never been able to stop it from leaking. But then again, it's my house. Of course, he went on to do the Sten Center at MIT, and they've never been able to stop that big science building from leaking either. But Gehry's work sure is kind of amazing, and likewise pushing the edges in many ways. Thank you. Well, is that it? Okay.
All right, thank you, Stuart. Really fascinating to see this collaboration, how it's affected architecture in our own area and throughout the country. So thank you for coming today. It's great to see everyone here, and thank you so much to Stuart Cohen for a fascinating lecture. Thank you.